At 2:23 p.m. on a frozen afternoon of December 17th, 1944, Ethan Rowe, 23 years old, tactical medic, was kneeling between two overturned stretchers on an improvised road in the heart of the Ardennes, trying to stop the bleeding of a soldier who could no longer keep his eyes open. The sky was a fixed slab of gray metal. The forest around them looked dead, and the feeling, the one veteran said always came before bombardment, was beginning to vibrate in the air like a primitive warning. Ethan heard it before anyone else. The sound was unmistakable, the hollow thump of German artillery pieces entering their firing sequence. He lifted his head slowly, like someone recognizing a ghost. The first impact came 11 seconds later, exploding against a supply truck at the rear. Shrapnel spun through the air like loose blades. The ground shook. A sergeant was thrown backward. Survivors threw themselves to the dirt on instinct. Ethan didn't throw himself down. He stood still for a moment, one long moment, listening to the pattern of the blast. It was familiar. This wasn't saturation fire. These were adjustment shots. Tests. The German artillery was calibrating the target. It meant the next round would be more precise, and the next even more, until nothing on that stretch of road remained alive. He knew this because he had heard it before. On the day his brother, Daniel, died, Ethan had sprinted across an entire hillside trying to reach him, guided only by the sounds. 3 test shots, then 4 corrections and the decisive salvo. He arrived 5 minutes too late. Since then, that cadence had stayed in his memory with frightening clarity, as if it had been stitched into the back of his skull. The second explosion came closer, throwing dust, dirty snow, and smoke over the stretchers. 2 drivers shouted his name. Ethan ignored them. His eyes swept across the terrain, as if calculating. In truth, he was measuring distances, slopes, natural mirrors, points of reverberation, thermal reflections. Old skills no one in the battalion knew he had. Ethan Rowe, the bandage kid, raised in scouting clubs, obsessed with mapping valleys, echoes, and illusions of sound. Those things had never been useful. Until now. The radio crackled. The reply was short. No reinforcements. Enemy artillery repositioning. Expect total destruction of target. The operator stared at Ethan like a man already counting himself dead. Some wounded soldiers began prey. Others tried to crawl nowhere. The landscape was 2 minutes away from becoming a crater of fire. And that was when Ethan's expression changed. It wasn't bravery. It wasn't heroism. It was calculation, cold, fast, and completely outside military doctrine. There was metal scattered around. There were tensionable tarps. There were flares. There was reflective snow. There were narrow embankments capable of distorting thermal signatures. And, most importantly, there was a slope to the left, perfect for creating a false trace of movement. The plan appeared in his mind fully formed. So quickly it was almost frightening. Create a phantom convoy to the north. Fake heat, fake echoes, fake reflections. Trick the artillery into firing at what didn't exist. Meanwhile, move 309 incapacitated soldiers through a route no officer in his right mind would use. A narrow, almost invisible path passing dangerously close to the German lines. The real escape route would be silent, low, hidden. The fake one bright, noisy, convincing. The next impact made the ground vibrate beneath his knees. Shrapnel sliced the canvas of the medical truck. Men screamed. A corporal grabbed Ethan's arm, thinking he was going into shock. Ethan pulled his arm back firm. Without raising his voice, he simply said, "If we stay here, we all die. If we give them another target, they'll shoot at the wrong place." The corporal stared at him. "You're a medic, Rowe, not a strategist. Today I'm whatever I have to be." He began gathering everything he could use. Metal plates, broken reflectors, leftover flares, strips of frozen tarp. He moved fast, decisive, as if he had trained for this, though he hadn't. It was instinct, memory, and pure urgency. Some soldiers followed him. Others hesitated. Ethan didn't wait for approval. He ran up the muddy embankment, positioning flares in precise spots, adjusting angles, improvising supports that would reflect light and heat, creating what, from 800 meters away, looked like the beginning of a vehicle maneuver. The illusion was taking shape, and the clock was running. Memories surged with brutal clarity. Daniel coughing blood, holding his hand, saying it's all right as he died. Ethan had never believed those words. Now he was trying to prevent 309 more men from meeting the same fate. A new blast echoed. Ethan heard the shift in tone. The artillery had detected the false movement. They were recalibrating. The illusion was working, but it wouldn't last long. The real evacuation corridor still had to be cleared. The narrowest one, the quietest one, the most suicidal one. Ethan looked back. The wounded trembled, some half-conscious, some already accepting there would be no escape. The wind cut at his face. Fine snow drifted through the air. Everything was on the verge of collapsing. And in that exact instant, Ethan understood. If he wanted to save them all, he would have to lead every step himself, because only he could hear the rhythm of death closing in. If the emotion of this narrative has reached you, pause and leave your right now. That small gesture is powerful. It tells the platform that these stories of forgotten heroism need to reach more hearts and minds. And, of course, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next chapter and what happens next. After all, the memory of those who lived the unimaginable is valuable. Your support is fundamental for us to keep their legacy alive, and you are an essential part of this mission of honor. The first medic Ethan Rowe lost that winter was Corporal Samuel Klein. December 3rd, 1944. Klein had been a frontline medic for 11 months. Dozens of evacuations. High-stress experience. Textbook discipline. He followed every protocol the U.S. Medical Corps drilled into its men. The doctrine was simple. Medics stay low. Medics stay behind infantry. Medics do not run ahead of cover. Medics move only when suppressive fire is active. Medics prioritize bleeding control first, movement second. Medics never cross open terrain without smoke. Klein followed every rule perfectly. The platoon was ambushed outside a burned farmhouse near Monshaw. A single machine gun nest-pinned them in place. Klein waited for the rifleman to lay suppressive fire, then crawled toward a wounded private 15 meters ahead. Perfect form. Low silhouette. Proper intervals between movements. He reached the casualty, stabilized the chest wound, and called for 2 riflemen to help drag him back. A second German team had been waiting. They had predicted the medic's path. Klein was shot through the neck. He died before the stretcher reached him. He followed doctrine perfectly and died anyway. The second medic Ethan lost was Private Curtis Doyle. December 9th. Doyle was 20, earnest, obedient, the kind of soldier who memorized manuals word for word. A mortar squad had been hit on the northern ridge. Doyle crawled out, timing his movements according to training. 3 seconds forward, stop. 3 more seconds, stop. Textbook evasion. The Germans dropped a single mortar precisely onto the trail of blood Doyle was following. They didn't need to see him. They just needed to know where a medic would go. He was vaporized in the blast. By mid-December, Ethan had watched 5 medics die the same way. Obedient, predictable, perfectly by the book. And that was why they died. German artillery units in the Ardennes weren't just firing blindly. They were tracking American behavior. They understood the sequence of medical response. Where medics ran, how they crawled, how they approached casualties, how they signaled for stretcher teams. American doctrine made the job easier for them. If you followed the book, you were predictable. If you were predictable, you died. The same pattern repeated from Luxembourg to St. Vith. A shelling begins. A unit calls medic. Medics sprint to the sound. Artillery tracks those sprints. Second volley lands. Medics die first. Wounded die next. Ethan studied each incident obsessively. He replayed events in his mind. Angles of impact, timing between salvos, casualty placement, how sound traveled to the trees, how the fog distorted echo. He started noticing something no superior bothered to see. The Germans weren't just firing where Americans were. They were firing where Americans would be next. It was a pattern of predicted movement, just like a sniper anticipating the escape route of his target. And Ethan understood that because he had lived it once already, on the hill where Daniel died. German guns had walked their shells across the slope using audio triangulation, adjusting for elevation, wind, and echo. Ethan had spotted every pattern. Too late to save his brother, but early enough to burn the rhythm into his brain forever. On December 16th, the morning of the convoy mission, Ethan tried warning Lieutenant Morris. He described the recalibration patterns he'd been hearing, the predictive nature of the barges, the way artillery teams were zeroing not on trucks but on sound clusters. Morris dismissed him with a tired wave. "Rowe, you're a medic, not artillery, not intelligence. Do your job. We move at 1400. Ethan didn't argue. Medics didn't argue. They patched wounds and kept their heads down. He spent the next 2 hours watching the fog creep across the tree line. Every gust of wind shifted sound direction. Every broken trunk changed how echoes bounced. Ethan memorized it all. When the first shell hit the convoy on the 17th, Ethan recognized the pattern instantly, not just that they were being targeted. But how? Where the next blast would fall. How fast the Germans were adjusting. How long they had until total annihilation. Everything clicked together with brutal clarity. The medics who died, the predictability of doctrine, the artillery logic, the fatal assumption that enemy gunners lacked precision in poor visibility. The truth was the opposite. Fog made American units louder. Snow made echoes sharper. Metal reflected heat signatures. Movement patterns were mathematically traceable. The convoy was trapped because it behaved exactly as German spotters expected. And Ethan understood in one cold, crystallizing moment that if he followed doctrine like Klein, like Doyle, like every dead medic he had carried off a field, he would kill all 309 wounded men with his obedience. His job was not to treat casualties anymore. His job was to break the rules. All of them. He had to become unpredictable. He had to become noise, confusion, illusion. He had to make the artillery mistake the world around them. Because if he didn't, the next salvo would erase every man on that road. The German artillery opened its third calibration volley at 1427. 3 shells, 2 short, 1 long. Classic pattern for range correction on a stationary column. Ethan Rowe heard the sequence and understood immediately. The guns were now within 90 meters of a perfect solution. The next correction would place the shells directly on the convoy's center mass. The cluster of trucks, medics, and the 309 wounded men who couldn't run, couldn't crawl, couldn't even lift their heads high enough to see death approaching. Lieutenant Morris shouted for the remaining drivers to turn the trucks around, but the road was too narrow, the mud too deep, and the engines too damaged. Some trucks had been shredded by shrapnel. Others had stalled in the smoke. Morris kept screaming orders that could not be followed. Ethan was not listening anymore. He was observing. The fog was thick enough to distort positional audio. The frozen mud was reflecting concussive waves differently across the ravine. The metallic debris was scattering thermal signatures. The wind was shifting south at a steady 6 miles per hour. All of it formed an invisible map in his mind. He saw the path the artillery believed the convoy was taking. He saw the path the artillery would fire on next. And he saw the narrow, lethal corridor the Germans were completely blind to. The logical route, up the ridge, away from enemy lines, was suicide, the only survivable route. Down the frozen creek bed, dangerously close to German observation posts, was considered untouchable by protocol. No officer would authorize it. No manual would approve it. No sane medic would lead it. But sane medics were the ones who died first. The few mobile soldiers looked to Ethan for instruction, something that had never happened before. He was the youngest medic on the field, the least senior, the least respected. But in that moment, everyone could see he was the only man assessing the battlefield instead of panicking inside it. He spoke clearly without hesitation. We're creating a false convoy, and we're moving the real one south. Quiet route, 0 noise, no lights, no patterns. Sergeant Hale stared at him in disbelief. South? That's toward the Germans. Yes, Ethan answered, which is why they won't expect it. Before anyone could object, another shell screamed overhead and detonated 50 meters behind them. The blast flung dirt and snow across the road, coating the wounded in gray powder. A stretcher team was knocked off balance. One of them vomited from shock. Ethan's internal clock accelerated. The Germans had reduced their error margin. One more correction. Then the lethal volley, the one designed to obliterate everything alive. He sprinted to the nearest truck wreck, ripped open a damaged crate, and pulled out metal ration lids, broken shovels, spare canteens, anything that reflected light or produced heat. He distributed them rapidly. You, hang these high on the ridge. Space them irregularly. You, fire 2 flares at 1429 on my signal. Not before. Not after. You, set the tarps at angles facing east. They need to glow under the fog. None of this made sense to the soldiers. All of it made perfect sense to Ethan. German artillery crews worked with pattern recognition. They interpreted reflections, heat clusters, sound distortions. They reconstructed movement based on sparse data and assumed rational behavior. Ethan's plan depended on the opposite, irrational behavior, unmilitary behavior, human unpredictability, weaponized. He moved from soldier to soldier, placing their hands on positions, forcing them to memorize timing, spacing, angle. They obeyed because the alternative, standing still, felt like awaiting execution. With the decoy line underway, he turned to the wounded. Some were delirious. Some were groaning. Some stared blankly at nothing. All of them were incapable of walking without support. Ethan evaluated them the same way he evaluated terrain. Clinically, the lightly wounded would help carry the severely wounded. The severely wounded would be silent, or be silenced with cloth and morphine. No voice could rise above a whisper. No metal could clink. No boot could break ice loudly. Any mistake, any noise, any deviation from the corridor path would expose them to German scouts, who would not hesitate to finish what the artillery had started. Sergeant Hale approached. Voice low. Row. If this goes wrong, it's on you. Ethan met his eyes with a calmness that did not feel like courage. It felt like inevitability. It already went wrong. I'm trying to make it survivable. At 1429, Ethan raised his hand. 2 flares shot upward from the ridge, blooming through the fog like false headlights. Metal plates clattered faintly as they caught the wind. Thermal signatures bounced across the slope in chaotic fragments. To an artillery spotter, it would look like trucks repositioning. To a thermal operator, it would look like engines warming. To anyone with binoculars, it would look like confusion, a perfect scenario for a kill shot. Ethan watched the sky. He waited. He listened. Then he heard it. 2 short thumps, 1 long. The same pattern as before, but shifted northward. They had taken the bait. He turned to the stretcher teams and said the words that would determine whether hundreds lived or died. Move. Now. Quiet. Follow me. And Ethan Rowe, the medic no one ever noticed, the bandaged kid, stepped into Frozen Creek bed, toward enemy lines, toward darkness, toward the only path left. The convoy followed. The Frozen Creek bed was only 1 meter wide in places, twisting like a pale scar through the burnt forest. Its surface was a thin crust of ice over dark, silent water. Any misstep loud enough to crack it could echo up the ravine, and German listening posts were less than 400 meters away. At 1431, Ethan Rowe led the first stretcher down the slope. He didn't speak, didn't gesture, didn't look back. He listened. Every second mattered. Every sound mattered more. Behind him, 309 wounded men were being dragged, carried half-lifted, half-pulled through mud and frostbite and shattered branches. 32 of them were classified as critical: abdominal hemorrhage, collapsed lung, femoral artery compromise, multiple fractures. Men who would die if jostled the wrong way. Men who would die if left behind. Ethan paced his steps with mathematical precision. Soft earth, 2 steps. Ice patch, 1 slow glide. Loose stone, step on the sides, not the center. He had learned these patterns in forests far away from war, during scouting trips where silence meant winning a badge, not staying alive. But the mechanics was the same. The forest punished noise. Now noise meant death. Up the ridge, the decoy line was fully active. Metal plates rattled irregularly. The reflective tarps glowed faintly under fog. The flares burned down into embers. At 1433, the Germans fired again. 3 detonations tore open the northern ridge. The ground shook so violently the stretchers rocked sideways. One private stumbled. Ethan caught him by the collar and held him upright without looking away from the creek. The artillery wasn't firing on them. It was firing on the ghost Ethan had built. He didn't allow himself relief. Not yet. German artillery crews were disciplined. They would confirm the kill. They would wait for movement. They would reassess thermal signatures. If anything seemed off, they would fire again, closer, deeper, indiscriminately. Ethan knew he had 4 to 6 minutes before the Germans realized no bodies were falling. No trucks were erupting in flame. No shrapnel echoes were bouncing back. That was all the time the convoy had. Halfway down the creek bed, Private Lewis whispered sharply, "Row, Corporal Banks isn't breathing right." Ethan knelt by the stretcher, one hand still raised to signal the column to halt. He listened to Banks's breathing, shallow, arrhythmic, wet. Right lung collapse. Likely flailed chest. If the man was jostled again, the broken rib could puncture deeper, or the hemorrhage could accelerate. Standard medical doctrine was absolute. Stabilize before transport. Ethan ignored doctrine. He tore a morphine syringe with his teeth, administered half the dose, cut a strip of his own undershirt, and wrapped it tight around Banks's torso in a compression pattern that was technically improper, but it redistributed pressure just enough to keep the rib from sawing deeper into the lung. It would hold for 20 minutes. Maybe. He signaled the column to move. At 14:35, another pattern reached Ethan's ears. A distant metallic snap, binoculars being adjusted, a soft clink, a German spotter shifting his canteen, a faint 2-syllable command, guttural, clipped, enemy patrol, close. Ethan froze mid-step. He raised a fist, and the entire line, 300 men, conscious and unconscious, became still as stone. Through the fog, 2 German silhouettes appeared at the ridge above the creek, rifles slung, scanning the forest. Their boots crushed frost in sharp, brittle sounds. They approached the edge of the ravine and peered down. Ethan pressed his back against a dead log, one hand covering Corporal Banks's mouth. Banks was delirious, trying to mutter something. The slightest exhale would echo upward. The Germans were 30 meters above them. Too close, far too close. One soldier raised binoculars and scanned north. Ethan followed the angle. The man was observing the fake convoy, searching for movement. If he saw the decoys weren't shifting, weren't smoking, weren't behaving like real trucks, he would call artillery correction immediately. Ethan evaluated options with cold precision. If he ordered the stretcher teams to retreat, the noise would give them away. If he tried to hide deeper in the creek bed, the ice might crack. If he attacked, even silently, the Germans would radio instantly. He chose the only tactic left. Stillness. Absolute, unnatural, inhuman stillness. He slowed his breathing, lowered his pulse, closed his eyes to reduce involuntary motion. He became part of the terrain. The Germans scanned the ravine for 12 full seconds, long enough to kill everyone. Then one of them muttered something in frustration, slapped his gloves against his coat, and signaled to withdraw. They moved east, tromping through the snow. Ethan waited 8 more seconds before signaling the convoy to resume movement. When he finally exhaled, his breath shook, the only tremor he had allowed himself. At 14:38, they reached the bend of the creek bed where the ravine deepened and the sound of water masked their movements. For the first time since the bombardment began, Ethan permitted a fraction of hope. Then the earth erupted behind them. A new artillery volley hammered the northern ridge, but this time the range had adjusted. The Germans were no longer convinced by the decoy. They were narrowing their aim. The next shots would land on the creek itself. Ethan didn't raise his voice. He simply looked at Hale and mouthed one word, "Run." And the entire column surged forward. Wounded carriers, medics, trembling, crawling, slipping, dragging life through ice while death recalibrated behind them. The clock was no longer running. It was sprinting. Ethan sprinted with it. The creek bed narrowed into a jagged stone corridor at 14:39. Walls rose sharply on both sides, funneling the wind into a cold whistle that drowned out distant sounds. Good for concealment, terrible for speed. The stretchers scraped against the rock. Boots slipped. Men stumbled. trying to move quickly without noise. Ethan Rowe didn't slow down. He had already calculated the artillery rhythm. 90 seconds between calibration volleys. 40 to 55 seconds of adjustment time. A 15-second window where German spotters reassess movement patterns. Once they confirmed the decoy wasn't real, they would triangulate the only remaining heat traces in the area. The creek bed. They were behind schedule. They had to accelerate. Sergeant Hale caught up to Ethan, breathing hard. The wounded can't keep this pace. Ethan didn't look at him. They don't have to. We do. They pushed forward. Behind them, the fourth salvo detonated along the upper ridge. The shock wave rolled down the ravine like a physical force. Ice cracked under their feet. Several men lost balance. One stretcher tipped sideways, nearly dropping a soldier with abdominal trauma into the rocks below. Ethan lunged, grabbing the stretcher corner with his left hand while bracing his right against the cliff wall. His shoulder wrenched violently, a tearing sensation, sharp, electric. He didn't react. Pain was irrelevant. He stabilized the stretcher and kept moving. At 14:41, Private Lang collapsed from exhaustion. His leg was broken, splinted poorly, and the jolt from the last blast was too much. He lay in the ice, gasping, unable to rise. For men tried to lift him. It was too slow, too loud, too predictable. Ethan knelt beside him. Lang, listen to me. You have to stay silent. No shouting. No panicking. Lang's teeth chattered uncontrollably. I can't. Ethan placed a gloved hand over his mouth to dampen the sound and signaled Hale. Together they formed a two-man carry, hooking Lang's arms over their shoulders while two others stabilized his splinted leg. The method was crude, improper for spinal risk, improper for fracture alignment, but standard medical rules no longer applied. Survival replaced correctness. They moved again. Above them, German boots thudded against the ridgeline. A patrol, closer than before. German voices echoed faintly, bouncing between the stone walls. Short words, crisp syllables, search pattern instructions. Ethan evaluated instantly. The patrol was sweeping south. Their angle suggested they suspected movement below. If they leaned over the ridge with binoculars, the entire column would be exposed. He signaled the halt with a clenched fist. The entire convoy stopped. Ethan raised his hand again, palm flat, motionless, the signal for total silence. German footsteps advanced. 1 pair, 3 pairs, 5 pairs. They stopped directly above the stretcher line. The men below, wounded and carriers alike, held their breaths until their lungs burned. A single cough, groan, or whispered prayer would alert the patrol. Every muscle in the column tightened. Even the unconscious seemed to sense the danger, their bodies unnaturally still. Ethan pressed himself against the rock wall, tilting his head, tracking sound with the precision of a hunting animal. He detected the soft metallic clink of a safety lever being tested. A German soldier checking his rifle readiness. Another sound. Fabric stretching slightly as someone raised binoculars toward the false convoy line. If the patrol didn't see wreckage or bodies, they would realize there was no target. They would call the artillery teams. The creek would be fired upon in seconds. Ethan acted, but not by moving, not by fighting, not by risking noise. He used the terrain. He picked up a pebble, small, smooth, silent in his palm. He leaned carefully to his right and flicked it across the creek bed, angling it to bounce off the opposite wall. The sound it made was tiny, barely a click, but the rock wall amplified it subtly, making it seem like an animal skittering deeper into the ravine. The German patrol reacted instantly. A voice barked a command. 2 soldiers turned and moved east, following the phantom noise. The others spread out, searching the wrong direction. Perfect. Exactly what Ethan needed. He waited a full 10 seconds, then signaled movement again. The convoy advanced through the narrowest part of the creek. The wounded were shaking uncontrollably now, partly from cold, partly from adrenaline, partly from the unnatural discipline of forced silence. Blood loss, hypothermia, and shock blurred their consciousness. Every second Ethan expected one of them to cry out involuntarily. At 1443, the ravine opened into a wider basin, a bowl-shaped depression with low visibility but terrible acoustics. A single echo here could bounce directly upward to the German lines. Ethan hated it immediately. He raised his hand for the column to stop and scan the terrain. His breath formed thin clouds that hung in the freezing air like smoke. The edges of the ravine were jagged, steep, coated with frost. The wind tunneled through the basin, distorting sound in unpredictable patterns. Carrying 309 wounded across it, without being heard, was nearly impossible. And then the fog shifted. A gust of winter air rolled in, dense and heavy, settling into the basin like spilled milk. Visibility dropped to a few meters. Sound muffled slightly under the weight of the fog. Ethan recognized the opportunity instantly. A natural sound blanket, a temporary one. He turned to hail. "We cross now. Fast." The basin became a frantic but silent blur of movement. Stretcher after stretcher, boot after boot, men crawling, dragging, stumbling through white haze that masked them like a shield. Then at 1445, the illusion ended. A sudden gust tore through the ravine and swept the fog upward like a curtain being lifted. Ethan's stomach dropped. The column was only halfway across. They were exposed, fully visible, a line of silhouettes moving in the open. And on the ridge above, German helmets, 6 of them, watching. One soldier raised his rifle. Ethan's mind fired through options like bullets. Retreat? Impossible. Freeze? Certain death. Charge? Suicide. Only one choice remained. He stepped forward, shielded his men with his body, and prepared to do the one thing no combat medic was ever trained for: draw enemy fire on purpose. At 14 hours 45 minutes and 7 seconds, the German rifleman on the ridge shouldered his weapon. No hesitation, no confusion, no warning. He had a perfect angle, downward slope, stationary silhouettes, clear line of fire. A single pull of the trigger would collapse the entire escape. Ethan Rose stepped into the open, not running, not ducking, not hiding. He moved with deliberate clarity, the kind of movement soldiers instinctively recognized. Not a wounded man, not a panicked retreat, but a target presenting itself. A lure. The German rifleman shifted aim immediately. Ethan saw the motion, the micro-tilt of the barrel, the inhale tightening the soldier's shoulders, the millisecond of stillness before recoil. Ethan dropped to one knee. The shot cracked. A sharp burst of sound slammed through the ravine. Rock splintered behind Ethan's head. Dust rained onto his collar. The German shouted. Indistinct, guttural syllables carried by cold wind. Ethan didn't move. He needed the patrol to focus on him. Only him. "Gio!" he hissed, barely audible. Hale grabbed the nearest stretcher, dragging it forward. The others followed, teeth clenched, shoulders burning, boots slipping. The wounded groaned softly, but the basin muffled the sound just enough. They crawled behind rocks and frost-covered logs, vanishing into the southern tree-line. In 10 seconds, half the column was out of direct line of sight. The Germans fired again. The second bullet hit the stone by Ethan's foot, ricocheting with a violent shriek. A third shot whistled past his shoulder, close enough to lift his coat fabric. He had no weapon, no cover worth trusting, no armor, just calculation. Ethan rose again and sprinted 3 steps to the left, exposing himself deliberately, unpredictably, breaking every survival instinct. A 4th shot followed the motion. He dove behind a boulder the size of a chair. It wasn't cover, just shape. What mattered wasn't the rock itself, but the angle it forced the Germans to compensate for. Artillery officers made corrections based on expected behavior. Snipers made adjustments based on standard evasion paths. Ethan refused to behave in either way. Behind him, stretcher teams reached the tree-line one by one. The movement was fast but erratic. Zigzags Ethan had drilled into them earlier to distort tracking. Nothing about their escape looked military or orderly. That chaos kept them alive. One German soldier shouted a command, demanding a correction of angle. Another switched to a scope rifle. Blood hammered in Ethan's ears as he realized they were coordinating, preparing a clean shot. He needed a distraction. He grabbed a fist-sized rock and threw it high, not far, but with a distinct arc that landed behind a fallen tree. It mimicked the weight of a retreating soldier. 2 Germans fired at the sound. Perfect. Ethan sprinted right, low, sliding across ice. His shoulder screamed, the same joint wrenched earlier. But pain was secondary. Noise, discipline was everything. He moved silently except for one deliberate crunch of ice, a false footfall placed to redirect their aim. A rifle barked. Stone fragments sliced Ethan's cheek. Warm blood mixed with freezing air. He ignored it. The last quarter of the convoy was crossing the basin now. The wounded were shaking uncontrollably. Stretcher carriers were at their limit. A man with a compound fracture began to moan, delirious. His voice rose. Hale slapped his hand over the soldier's mouth just in time. Ethan saw it all from the corner of his eye, saw the chaos, saw the desperation, saw the line thinning. He stood fully, deliberately, exposing his silhouette against the pale fog, the most visible thing in the entire ravine. One German soldier shouted in triumph. They had him. Good. Ethan pointed at the Germans, a foolish, reckless gesture, but the movement was intentional. It demanded attention. It was a challenge. It made him the center of the scene. They fired. Ethan dove hard, rolling behind a downed pine, every muscle blazing. The bullet cracked through the air where his head had been. Wood splintered. Resin sprayed. He did not stay down. He rose again. Another shot. He ducked. Another shot. He slid sideways. Every movement unpredictable. Every dodge ruining their firing rhythm. Every risk buying seconds. Seconds a wounded needed. Hale reached the tree lean with the last stretcher at 14 hours 46 minutes and 52 seconds. He looked back and saw Ethan still exposed, still drawing fire, still maneuvering like a decoy with human lungs and human fear. Hale's face tightened. He whispered, "Row, what the hell are you doing?" Ethan was doing math. Distance to cover. Angle of German rifles. Wind direction shifting northwest. Echo spread narrowing. Artillery recalibration likely at 1448. And one more factor. He was the only moving target in sight. The Germans finally realized it. They stopped firing, stopped shouting, went silent. That was worse. Ethan knew why. A still rifleman was adjusting aim, taking time, preparing a single precise shot, the kill shot. Ethan couldn't run. He couldn't freeze. He couldn't hide. So he did the one thing the Germans would never predict. He stepped toward them, into open ground, into full view, into the rifle's perfect angle. The German sniper fired. The bullet struck, exploding snow, splintering wood, cutting a line across the earth. But not Ethan. He had moved at the last possible fraction of a second, slipping behind a slanted boulder that deflected the shot upward. He felt the heat of the near-miss graze his coat. The force rattled his bones. And then, silence. A thin, terrible silence. Not from the Germans. From the sky. The artillery had finished recalibrating. The next volley would fall based on sound, heat, and target movement. Ethan had 30 wounded men still exposed behind him in the basin. 30 men the artillery would kill unless someone redirected the next shelling. Someone loud. Someone visible. Someone stupid enough to risk standing under a falling sky. Ethan inhaled slowly. He turned toward the open ridge. He prepared to run toward danger one more time. Not as a medic, not as prey, but as bait. At 14 hours 47 minutes and 2 seconds, Ethan Rowe ran toward the ridge as if the open sky itself were dragging him forward. Every step was deliberate, loud, intentional. He wasn't running from the Germans. He was running for them, to make himself the clearest, closest, most tempting target on the field. Behind him, the final stretchers vanished into the tree lean. Hale stopped, frozen between duty and instinct, watching Ethan climb the slope alone. The Germans spotted him instantly. A shout, a rifle raised, a scope gleaming through fog. Ethan darted sideways, boots slicing through snow. A bullet cracked past his arm. Another shattered a stone beside him. He didn't slow. He needed them to keep firing, to keep tracking him, to believe the entire American column was clustered on this ridge. At 14 hours, 47 minutes, and 19 seconds, he reached the crest and stood tall, fully exposed. A perfect silhouette. A German sniper fired. Ethan dropped flat. The round hissed over his skull. He rolled behind a fallen pine and stomped hard on the trunk, twice, producing two sharp echoes. The sound bounced across the ridge in strange angles. Exactly what German spotters listened for, movement clusters, not single silhouettes. They took the bait. Coordinates shouted. A radio crackle. A single command. Fewer. Ethan heard the artillery fire miles away. That deep, metallic thump that meant death was already in the air. He had 12 seconds, maybe less. He sprinted downhill. The first shell landed exactly where he had stood seconds earlier, shredding the pine into burning fragments. The blast launched him forward, slamming him into the snow. His vision blurred. His ears rang. But he moved. The second shell detonated farther north, where the German spotter believed the wounded were fleeing. The third and fourth walked their fire across the ridge, hammering the false positions Ethan had created. The ground shook as if the forest itself were collapsing. Ethan stumbled into the treeline just as the fifth shell hit. A wall of sound rolled over him. He fell to one knee, choking on smoke, snow, and adrenaline. Then silence. A long, empty silence that seemed impossible after so much thunder. Hale emerged from the shadows, eyes wide. "Ro, you're alive." Ethan didn't answer immediately. His chest burned. His shoulder throbbed. Blood trickled down his cheek. But the forest was quiet. Not the silence of death, but a survival. Behind Hale, hundreds of wounded men lay scattered among the trees, exhausted, shaking, but alive. Medics were already tending to them. Some soldiers whispered his name. Others just stared, trying to comprehend what had happened. He looked at them, at the faces he had dragged through ice, through fear, through fire. 309 men breathing. 309 men who should have died on that road. Ethan sank onto a fallen log. Snow drifted around him like ash. His hands trembled, finally releasing the strain of holding an entire world together by instinct and desperation. No cheers, no medals, no officers praising strategy. Just men alive because he refused to follow rules that guaranteed their death. As dusk settled over the forest, Ethan looked at the ridge one last time. The ridge that had nearly killed him. The ridge where he had tricked an entire artillery battery. The ridge that would appear in no official report. Hale sat beside him quietly. "You saved them, Ro." Ethan shook his head faintly. "I just changed the pattern." But deep down he knew the truth. He had finally outrun the cadence that killed his brother. And in the frozen stillness of the Ardennes, Ethan Rowe understood what his legacy would be. Not medals, not rank, not recognition. Just a whisper carried by survivors. The medic who fooled the artillery.